For those of you who don't know me, I'm Martin Underhill, the Police Crime Commissioner of the PCC for Dorset, and welcome to this lecture. And as James has just said, this is a culmination, the finale of a week of awareness events raising issues of mental health. I am a campaigner for mental health. I have lived experience of mental health, and I believe that the mental health services have to get better. And I'm really pleased to introduce you to one of my heroes. I don't have many heroes. In the world of politics, you don't have heroes. But trust me, this man is a hero of mine. I met Norman nationally. I represent Police Crime Commissioners nationally, and we work together on the Crisis Concordat, giving access for care plans to police officers, and various other initiatives, because Norman is driven by the desire to make mental health services better in policing and across the piece. Norman Lamb is an MP and has been a long time. He was re-elected in May. Before the coalition government ended in May, he was the care minister, care and support minister from 2012 to 2015. Since he stopped being a minister, he is now, and a real coup for him, and it just shows how seriously he is regarded in the mental health arena. He's just been appointed chair of a commission to bring together mental health services across the West Midlands as they devolve into one authority. That shows the mark of the man, really. He achieved so much in government for mental health. He humbles me, and he has achieved so much now for mental health that he humbles me. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to introduce you to Norman Lamb.
Well, thank you, Martin. I'm slightly embarrassed by that introduction, but it's very kind of you, and a bit of a mutual admiration society, because I've got a great regard for the work that Martin has done. One of the things that Martin mentioned was the Crisis Care Concordat, and this is all about setting standards for crisis care in mental health for the first time ever. They've never existed until now, and it's about bringing together mental health services and police. Too often in the past we've had these two organisations, two public services, both with, in a sense, a responsibility for a particular group of people, but operating totally separately and in silos, not talking sufficiently to each other, and therefore ultimately failing that highly vulnerable group of people. And the Crisis Care Concordat sort of requires every area of the country to come together to work out a plan to implement the principles of good crisis care. And one of the things that we set was an objective of reducing by 50% the number of people who end up in police cells over a 2-year period. We achieved that. And it was an interesting experiment in a way, because it wasn't government sort of imposing its will on local areas, as usually happens, you know, the diktat from on high. It was to say to local areas, look, you come together, you develop your own plan, you work out how to do it locally, but the principles are very clear, and we all need to commit to this. And it has resulted in a dramatic amount of activity around the country, with every area developing a plan on time by the end of last year, and now seeking to implement it to, as I say, improve the quality of care for some of the most vulnerable people. But it was, the interesting thing I found was that it was often actually the police that led the way in terms of inspiring leadership in local areas. And Martin was a perfect example of that from his role as a Police and Crime Commissioner, driving change in their locality. And I don't care where the leadership comes from. We need leadership to change, in a sense, a completely fractured, broken system. And Martin provided that in his community. So I had enormous admiration for Martin as well. So mutual admiration, Martin. It's very good to be here, and I would like to particularly thank Bournemouth University for hosting this whole event this week, and for all of the different organisations who've played their part in bringing this together and putting on what looks like a fascinating programme of work that you've had during the week. It sort of matches with my complete passion for the issue of mental health, and in a sense the pursuit of equality for those who suffer from mental ill health. And I suppose I want to start also right at the start by putting cards on the table. This is not a theoretical interest of mine. It's not a job that I had to do in government, which I sort of had a passing interest in. My family has experienced mental ill health in quite a profound way. Our oldest son diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder at the age of 16. Fascinatingly, we did a joint interview a few months ago, back in March, with The Times, with Rosemary Bennett, the health correspondent on The Times. And we talked about OCD, but we also talked about our experience as a family, and in particular Archie's experience as a teenager. And it was fascinating because he actually came out with stuff that he'd never previously revealed. He just opened up. And this is incidentally one of the really important things we need to do to combat stigma, just getting people talking about their own experience of mental ill health and getting across the fact that this is an illness like any other, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. But when he talked about his experience, and it became apparent that for about 3 years before he talked to us and sought help, he was having dark thoughts, worrying constantly about those dark thoughts. Just think about it, a child aged 12, 13, not feeling able to go to anyone, feeling that you're the only one who's going mad. Just think about the impact that has on your development, on your capacity to learn, on your capacity to have friends and good relationships. And so our experience, and incidentally, it's not just our son. My oldest sister has recently taken her own life, which is tragic. And we've gone through the mourning of her death. But I realise that our family is like very many others in this country, like probably many of the families represented here in this room. And I suppose the thing that I wanted to get across to you, first of all, is that there is at the moment an outrageous discrimination at the heart of the NHS. If you suffer from suspected cancer, you have a right to see a specialist within 2 weeks of referral by your GP, and rightly so. It was introduced by the last Labour government, and it was right to do that because up until then, people were waiting far too long, and we know that your chances of recovery depend on how quickly you're diagnosed and how quickly you're treated. And incidentally, they were right also to introduce all sorts of other waiting time standards, including the 18-week maximum referral from your GP to your operation. But they left out mental health. And so if you're a teenager who suffers a first episode of psychosis, up until April this year, there was no standard, no right at all to access treatment on a timely basis. And yet we know that if you neglect psychosis, if you do nothing about it after the first episode, it can become entrenched, and that individual runs the risk of a miserable life, a life on benefits, a life with difficult relationships. And yet if we intervene quickly, there is lots of evidence to show that you can rescue that individual and give them the chance of a good life. So why not do it? And why should that youngster not have the same right to access treatment as someone who has suspected cancer? Now, I'm very proud of the fact that we introduced the first ever maximum waiting time standards in mental health from April this year, a 2-week standard for early intervention in psychosis, and a 6-week standard for access to psychological therapies under the IAPT programme. But that still leaves the majority of people who suffer from mental ill health with no access standard at all. So a youngster who suffers from an eating disorder, a disorder that we know can kill, they have no right to access treatment on a timely basis. In many parts of the country, the service is good, and you get access, but in many other parts of the country it is dire. It's highly variable, and too often these services get cut back when the going gets tough. Another example of the outrageous and discriminatory treatment of those who suffer from mental ill health is this. If you had a stroke, just imagine an ambulance turning up to take you to hospital, and you're told, well, there's no bed locally, but there is one in Lancashire. We'll take you to Lancashire, 200, 300, 400 miles away. Just imagine what the Daily Mail would be saying if that was to happen with people who suffered a stroke. And yet it happens every week of the year in mental health. How can you possibly justify that, particularly when you know the impact that that sort of treatment has on individuals? I was talking just this week to a lad who's a journalist in my own county of Norfolk, and his parents. And he was, after a suicide attempt, taken off to a hospital in London, a private hospital in London, because there was no bed available in Norfolk. For 10 days, 10 nights, he stayed at that hospital in London without any proactive treatment at all. It was just containment at an enormously high cost to the system, achieving absolutely nothing before eventually being returned home to Norfolk. Another one, patient from Norfolk, was also in the same hospital. He was told at 1 a.m. one night that he would be returned to Norfolk in an hour. He was transported through the night without any thought for his well-being or the therapeutic impact of that journey. People are treated appallingly in mental ill health still, and it's a complete difference from the way in which people are treated who have physical health problems. And that discrimination has got to end. It's as simple as that. You cannot begin to justify it in a civilised society. I remember last year being on 5 Live, and I was on just after a teenager, a girl, who talked about the fact that at the age of 15, she was placed in a police cell in a mental health crisis. And she talked about her shame and embarrassment that she was the first member of her family ever to be put in a police cell. She'd committed no crime. She was suffering a mental health crisis. Well, this has to end. We just have to accept as a society that we must end out-of-area placements, as they're called. We must end youngsters being put into police cells. We must end adults being put into police cells, except in the most extreme circumstances where the individual at that moment is a particular danger to themselves or to others, and it's the only possible place they can go. It's absolutely the exception, and yet still thousands of people every year get put in police cells. So let me talk specifically about children and young people. Last year, having been in the job for some time, I reached the conclusion that the system of mental health services for children and young people was completely dysfunctional, was failing young people, and that it needed a fundamental overhaul. And so I established a working group. I wanted it to be not to be dominated by Whitehall, to include campaign organisations like Young Minds, to include academics, practitioners, people in education, so that we brought the best minds to bear on the subject. But the environment that we were looking at was a system where you have completely dysfunctional commissioning. We have 4 different organisations commissioning care for children and young people: schools, local authorities, clinical commissioning groups, and NHS England. And it's worse than that because there are ridiculous perverse incentives involved. If you shunt someone into tier 4, just imagine for any family being told about tiers 1, 2, 3 and 4. The language means absolutely nothing to anyone. I had no idea what we were talking about for a very long time as the minister. We're getting rid of all of that. But if you put someone into tier 4, the most acute end of the spectrum, then at a local level, you are no longer responsible for the funding of that individual. So there is a direct incentive to push someone into the top tier, whereas the incentives actually ought to be all about prevention of deterioration of condition. So it's got it completely the wrong way round. We have a system which simply doesn't focus in any meaningful way on preventing ill health and preventing deterioration, on building youngsters' resilience. We have a dislocation between schools and mental health services. We have the potential for great access to fantastic information and advice online, and yet most youngsters don't get access to that valuable information. So we have a system that is dreadfully failing young people, with less than 25% of young people who have mental ill health actually getting access to any support at all. Again, something that would never ever be tolerated in physical health services. So the panel that we established reported before the general election. Its report is called Future in Mind, and if you haven't seen it, I would really encourage you to read it, because there's an extraordinary consensus behind the recommendations in this report. We got everyone on board. There was no dissent for what this report was saying, and it, in a sense, it creates a blueprint for the modernisation of children and young people's mental health services. And the obligation now is to make sure that we implement it. But clearly it requires money to implement it. We can't escape from that fact. And of course, as the finances of the NHS and the care system have been pretty tight over the last 5 years, of course mental health has always lost out, because there aren't the same access standards, because the financial incentives are completely different in physical health compared to mental health. It's always mental health that gets cut, gets squeezed at a local level. So it needs more investment. So in the budget in March of this year, Nick Clegg negotiated for £1.25 billion for children and young people's mental health services over the course of this Parliament. In other words, £250 million per year extra throughout this Parliament. It's a significant percentage increase on existing funding. But watch, just beware, because in year one, instead of it being 250 million, it's 141 million. It's already being shortchanged. And we all, every one of us who cares about children and young people's mental health, ought to be holding this government to account to ensure that the money they agreed in the budget just back in March is actually delivered, to ensure that this blueprint can actually be delivered on the ground in every part of our country. I have been very clear that the shortfall must be made up in year two, because if it's not, it will be lost for good. We must be in no doubt about that. But the principles set out in here, I think, are really important. First of all, it's the whole principle of building resilience, working on the basis of preventing a deterioration of condition, bringing schools and mental health services much more closely together, ensuring that there is a point of contact between the school and local mental health services, bringing mental health services into schools rather than a sort of remote referral. I just think it back again to our son and the idea of, at the age of 15, being referred to a mental health service at the age of 15 must be a frightening experience for any teenager. So let's try and reduce that fear. Let's bring it right upstream, as they say, into schools. The role of the third sector can be incredibly valuable. There's an organisation in my home city of Norwich called MAP, the Mancroft Advice Project. They go into schools at lunchtimes, at the end of the day. They have they call it, what do they call it? Life zones. They just go in there and they enable youngsters to just talk confidentially to someone who they can trust, to someone who isn't part of the school establishment, because there may be a fear about that. And it's not designated as a mental health service. It's there to talk about all of the sort of teenage angst issues, whether it's sexual health, whether it's drugs or alcohol, whether it's fears about their educational attainment, or whether it's because they are really worried about something that's going on in their mind. It enables people to download, to talk confidentially, right at that early stage to ensure that you can nip the problem in the bud. So the role of the third sector can be brilliant at that sort of engagement with young people. It talks about the idea of a one-stop shop in every locality without the need to be referred by your GP, so that you could just go in as a youngster yourself to seek help when you need it. It refers to the importance of using these brilliant online platforms that now exist to ensure that every youngster across the country knows how to get help. Just imagine every teenager spends their life on their mobile phone or their tablet, and yet they don't know about all of the information that's available on there. So let's make sure that they are aware and they can make use of that facility. It talks about linking the whole system up together so that we have joined up commissioning rather than this horrible fragmentation between 4 different organisations, one lead commissioner locally. And the exciting thing is that at the end of the whole process, we argued that we should get, just like the Crisis Care Concordat, where we asked local areas to come up with a plan for how they were going to implement it in their area, we did the same with this. We said to local areas, get all the key people together, work with your schools, engage with the schools to come up with your own transformation plan about how you change things in your locality. And in return for coming up with a compelling transformation plan, you will get your share of the extra money. It's a sort of bribe, but it sort of encourages people to do the right thing. And the deadline for the submission of these transformation plans is actually a week today, the 16th of October. I talked to the chief executive of that organisation in Norwich yesterday, the Mancroft Advice Project, and he said this is the best thing that has happened for years. It's got people talking together. It's got the statutory services listening to people in the third sector, and it's got an absolute focus on prevention rather than waiting until the crisis has developed. So this is an opportunity. But first, we must hold the government to account to deliver the money that is already agreed and that is necessary to implement this blueprint for children and young people's mental health services. I believe that if we see the investment that is already agreed, if local areas follow the principles in here about building resilience, about focusing on prevention, then I think we've got the opportunity to transform services for children and young people, to increase the number of youngsters that we can reach, to ensure that they get help when they need it, and to give youngsters the chance of a better life. There is an overwhelming imperative to do this. There is a moral and an economic obligation, it seems to me, for us to deliver on this, because be in no doubt we are letting down at the moment so many children and young people. The wasted talent in our country is just unbelievable. We've got the opportunity to give people the chance of a better life, and we have a moral obligation to deliver it. Thank you very much.